Execution 6, 6, 7, 7. Synchronization 6, 6.5, 6, 6.5, 7.5. Toby Dorey and Sam Baker, City of Leeds Diving Club, inward dive, Pikes. Execution 3.5, 3, 5.5, 6.5. Synchronization 5, 3.5, 4.5, 4, 3. Round 2, Bobby and Theo, reverse dive with tuck. Execution 4, 5, 5, 6. Synchronization 5, 4.5, 4.5, 5.5, 5. Isaac and George, back dive, piked. Execution 6.5, 7, 6, 7. Synchronization 7, 7.5, 6.5, 7.5, 8. Bo and Blake, black back dive, piked. I'll speed it up. Execution 5.5, 6, 7.5, 7.5. Synchronization 6, 6, 6.5, 7, 6. Jared and Vico, back dive, piked. Execution 7, 6.5, 5, 5. Synchronization 5.5, 5, 5, 4.5, 5. Sebastian and Leonard, back dive, piked. Execution 5.5, 5, 5.5, 5.5. Synchronization 5.5, 5.5, 5, 5, 5.5. Toby and Sam, back dive, piked. Execution 2, 1.5, 5.5, 5. Synchronization 4, 2, 3.5, 5, 3. Can we just remind audiences, please, to not use flash photography during the performance of a dive? If you could check your settings, please, that would be great. Thank you. On to round 3, Bobby and Theo, forward 1.5 somersaults with tuck. Execution 4.5, 5.5, 5.5, 5.5. Synchronization 5, 6, 5, 5, 5. Isaac and George, inward 1.5 somersaults with tuck. Execution, 5.5, 5.5, 5.5, 4.5. Synchronization, 4, 4.5, 4, 4.5, 5. Bo and Blake, inward 1.5 somersaults with tuck. Execution, 5, 5.5, 6, 6. Synchronization, 5.5, 6.5, 6, 5.5, 6. Jared and Vico, forward 1.5 somersaults, piked. Execution, 5.5, 6, 5.5, 6. Synchronization, 6, 6.5, 6, 6, 6. Sebastian and Leonard, forward 1.5 somersaults, piked. Execution, 5, 4.5, 6.5, 6.5. Synchronization, 5, 5, 4.5, 4.5, 6.5. Toby and Sam, forward 1.5 somersaults, piked. Execution, 3.5, 3.5, 5.5, 6. Synchronization, 5, 5.5, 4.5, 4.5, 4.5. Fourth and final round, Bobby Cole and Theo Wills, Plymouth diving, inward 1.5 somersaults with tuck. Execution, 5.5, 5, 5, 5.5. Synchronization, 5, 6, 5, 5, 4.5. Isaac Beck and George Story Field, City of Sheffield, forward double somersaults with tuck. Execution, 4.5, 4.5, 5, 4.5. Synchronization, 6.5, 6.5, 6, 5, 5. Bo Barry and Blake Sroxton, Southend diving, forward double somersaults with tuck. Execution, 4.5, 5, 6, 5. Synchronization, 5.5, 6, 6.5, 6, 5.5. Jared Hull and Vico Mattioli, Dive London Aquatics, inward 1.5 somersaults with tuck. Execution, 6.5, 5, 5, 6. Synchronization, 4.5, 5, 5, 5.5, 5.5. Sebastian Karanjit of City of Sheffield and Leonard Soltianu of Corby Steel, back 1.5 somersaults with tuck. Execution 5, 5, 5.5, 6.5. Synchronization 6.5, 6, 5.5, 5.5, 6. And finally, Toby Dory and Sam Baker, City of Leeds Diving Club, inward 2.5 somersaults with tuck. Execution 5.5, 5.5, 6, 5.5. Synchronization 6.5, 6, 6, 6, 6. That concludes the competition. Thank you, divers, judges, and recorders. We will have those results for you as soon as we can. And